Hi. In this version 1.19 of Flightplan Visualizer, a lot of the data for the airlines have been updated. And I would like to thank Bruce Nicholson for his assistance updating these. Updating these data is a manual job, and it's hard to come by the data for this, so it's a huge help updating these data. Also, as usual, all the flight plans have been updated. Because of COVID-19 and the influence it had on the airline industry, not many flight plans, new flight plans for new airlines have been released. For example, if we look here in the downloader for summer 2020, you see they don't even take up a full screen, the new updated flight plans. But choosing, for example, 19, you can see we have multiple pages of updates, and the same for 18. Even though there are not many new flight plans in this version, a lot of flight plans have been updated. As you can see here, this V2 means it's the second version or the second revision. And here we have a third revision. So a lot of flight plans have been updated nevertheless in this release. As a new feature in this software, we can now connect to a flight simulator using FS UIPC. And the reason I chose FS UIPC is partly because I have worked a lot with it in the past. And also it does not, like SimConnect, require a specific version of the DLL to connect to a specific version of a flight simulator. And also, if there are any XP users using this software, they should be able to use XUIPC instead to connect to the simulator. As you can see up here, we are told right now that we are not connected to a simulator. And that's because by default in this version, it will not automatically try to connect to a simulator. While recording this video, I have my prepared version 4.5 running here in the background. And we can now connect to the simulator. Before I show that, let's go to settings. As a new feature in this software, it can now play audio files. And it will play an audio file when you connect to the simulator and when you disconnect. Here you can set the volume for that sound. And first of all, you can choose which audio device to use. And then you can test the level of those sounds. I have lowered it here to 10%, but by default it will be set to 50%. So you can, on your own system, you can choose whichever level you want. If you don't want to hear anything, simply set the volume level to 0% and it will not play anything. But here, pressing the test buttons, first connect.
Connected.
And disconnected.
Disconnected.
Also, while we're in here, I'll mention that we also have a test case, a settings for Morse codes. We can dial in a volume for that Morse code and we can press test. And it's simply the letters TEST that we are hearing as Morse codes. It will run with a default setting of speed of 1, meaning that a dot will only be 50 milliseconds and a dash will be 3 times as long. So you can increase or decrease the speed of the Morse code. For example, here the lowest setting. And here the highest setting. But you should run it here with the settings 1, that's the normal speed. And also here you can set the auto connect to the simulator. When auto connect is enabled, you don't have to do anything. The program will automatically detect that a simulator is running, and it will automatically connect to it. Personally, I have tested it both with the new MSFS and prepared version 4.5. But I suggest you will not enable auto connect in the beginning. First, try the manual connect and see how things are working for you. There's no known issues, but this is a new feature, so I suggest running with the manual connection for now. And then when you're happy that things are working out, then enable auto connect. And if you do run into anything, please mention it on the forum so I can look at it. Let's go and do a manual connect. In the file menu, you have these two new menu items. And if you enable auto connect, these will be disabled. But let's try to manual connect. We should hear the sound for being connected.
Connected.
There was the sound. Beside the sound, we got a new icon up here and an enlarged version down here. This green checkbox tells that we are connected. So if we manual disconnect,
Disconnected.
we hear the disconnected sound, and the two icons again change with this red circle with a white cross to indicate that the connection have been lost. Before we connected the first time, we had a logo displayed down here, and that's simply being replaced so you can see when you are connected or not. While disconnected, you can see that these two checkboxes to show the user aircraft are disabled. And that's because naturally when we're not connected, we don't know the location of the aircraft. So let's connect again.
Connected.
And now you see these are enabled. I can check this one to display the user aircraft. And here it is. If I move the map somewhere else, if I click this center, the map will center on the user aircraft. And while centered, you can zoom in and the map will update and pan to be centered around the user aircraft. It's not using very much CPU power doing this. As you can see here, right now that we are moving the map, we are using a bit more power than if we disable this automatic censoring. Now you see that it's hardly using any CPU power at all. But it is in that range about 0.2, 0.4% that it will be using. Hovering the mouse over the icon, you will see the GPS position of the aircraft, you will see the heading, you will see the altitude, the vertical speeds, the ground speed, and the indicated airspeed. Next, I'm going to stop the aircraft flying right now, and I will park it at a gate at an airport, and we will return to the map to see how that looks. Now I have parked the airplane at a gate in the Copenhagen airport, and we can see here that it's stationary. The lower line reads it's 0 knots, so we have a stationary location. If I search Copenhagen Airport and we go to the gates map, you can now show the aircraft, and like the main map, we can choose to automatic center on the aircraft. And this scenery I'm using right now is the default Copenhagen airport from prepared, and it's not very accurate, and that's because the aircraft is shown down here even though we are parked at a gate. But it's the same feature. You can see the location and so on. So for example, you could center the map, and you could use this feature to on a secondary monitor to show your location at the airport while you taxi around to find your way to your runways and so on. In this view, there is a limitation for how long time you can see your aircraft. It will only show the aircraft in this map as long as you are within 20 nautical mile of this airport. So if I were to take off from Copenhagen and fly, for the first 20 nautical mile, I could see my aircraft on this map. And at that point, it would automatically disappear, even though it says show a user aircraft. And when you hover the mouse over this label or this check mark, it will show a hint telling you that your distance to this airport is greater than 20 nautical mile. It's not meant to be used to show your location of your aircraft while you fly a flight, but its only purpose is to show your location at that airport. Right now, being able to show the aircraft in this map and in this map might see as a novelty feature. I have some plans for why I want to connect to the flight simulator. And in this version, it's more or less a showcase to test that code. I wrote that library to connect to FS-UIPC from the ground up. So for this version, for those of you using it, I would like you to try it out and test it. As I said before, there is no known problems with this, but I would like to hear feedback from you. When you connect to the simulator, you're told for which simulator you have connected. Here it have connected. I have connected to 64-bit version of Prepared, and it shows which version of FS-UIPC I'm using. If you run the software on a second computer and you're using WideFS, you should see that also up here in this connection string. And this prefix is from the last version 1.18 I released of Flightplan Visualizer. I explained how you could use these prefixes.
Disconnected.
So this is how the new feature connect and disconnect to the flight simulator is working. In the release note for version 1.18, I wrote that I had changed the program to be 64-bit. However, I failed to do that. It was only my internal development version I changed to 64-bit. So in this version, the release version have been changed to be 64-bit as I planned to do the last time. And the reason for that is those of you with many active flight plans, you might need more memory, as all flight plans are loaded into memory at startup. So the more flight plans you have active, the more memory the program will consume. So now in this version, if you go into the About box, you will see here the amount of memory that have been used. The peak memory is the highest consumption it had, and that's measured just after having loaded all the flight plans. And that's because all flight plans are packed, they are zipped. So when it loads a flight plan, for a short while, it both need to have the packed and the unpacked version of that flight plan in memory at the same time. But as soon as all flight plans have been loaded, it can release that memory again. So that's why we have this peak memory consumption. And here down here we see the current consumption. Beside being able to see these values in the About box, they are also put in the log file. So if I close this one and open, show the log, we can see here that when I open I open the About box, and that made the program forcefully commit these values to the log file. And that's why it's say forced here, because I forced it to do it. It's the same when the program starts and it loads all the active flight plans. Again, the program is forced to log the memory consumption. Other than that, the program while it's running. It will from time to time measure the memory consumption. And if it sees a rise in memory consumption, it will log that also. And that's for debugging purposes. I have some plans for this software in the future that might use more memory, and I'm not sure how much more it will use. So the memory being logged to the log file, we have a chance to both see how much it's using when it's running as it should. And if I do run into some issues during development, I see it's keep eating memory that it shouldn't do, I have a option to see that something wrong now, that the memory consumptions are being logged. You shouldn't, it's not important for you to look at these values. If you want to, they're here either in the log file or the about box, but the major purpose is for debugging in the future. In version 1.17, I added the feature that you could create your own user airline. For every version, I will, in most cases, update some of the airline. As I said in the beginning of this video, Bruce Nicholson have been a great help trying to help me update these information about the airlines. But from time to time, there will be chances you are going to import an flight plan, and for which there is no airline if it's a new airline. And for that purpose, you can create your user airlines. So let's open the menu for that. It's here in the MISC menu, user airlines. Here you can see I have some that I use myself. When you're going to add a new user airline, you simply click Add. And you can enter the ICAO code, the IATA code, the name, call sign, and so on. In the previous version, when you created a user airline, you've both had to select the country of that airline. For example, if it's an United States airline, you both had to choose the country, and you had to click this button to set the load factor to the default value. In this version, I have changed it so you only need to select the country, and doing so, it will automatically choose that load factor for that country. Here you see it's 88.7. If we choose another country, 88.5 here, 70.6. Most of these load factors are based on the region and sub-region of that country. If I get better data, I can set it per country. And yourself, if you create a user airline, you can simply click this button and you're free to either use the up-down arrows or simply type in the load factor. If you uncheck it, it will go back to the default value for that country. So that is what have changed here. Beside adding your own user airlines, you can also look up airlines. For me and Bruce updating these data, it's important for us being able to look the airline, because before adding a user airline, we will look if there is an airline already in the database for this, perhaps spelled a bit different or named a bit different from what we expect, so we don't have two entries for the same airline. And for that, you can use the lookup feature. Let's try to look up Air Nostrum. We can see by this check mark that it's in use, meaning there are flight plans utilizing this airline. But in the previous version, you could not see which. There are flight plans using this airline, but you could not see which it were. In this version, you can right-click it and choose this new menu item called Show Usage. It will show this small report where we can see the IATA and the ICAO codes for the airline. We can see for how many aircraft it's used as a carrier, for how many it's used as the operator. And based on that, it will be classified. In this case, with only being operator of only 35 aircraft, it have been classified as a minor airline. This classification, I have some ideas how I want to use that in the future. But right now, it's simply, you can see it as a way to see the size, to quickly see the size of that airline. And here below, we can see exactly which aircraft for which we are either the operator the carrier or the operator. As we can see up here, we are carrier for none, so it will begin with a 0. But we can see they are the operator of 5 ATR 72-600, 6 CRJ 200, 6 CRJ 900, and 18 CRJ 1000s. And here we have perhaps the most important information of all. We can see which of the flight plans are using this aircraft. For example, we have this Iberia regional. So being lazy, I simply copy the name and I paste it in here. And while doing that, let me mention a new feature in this version. And as you see, it picked the flight plan automatic. In the previous version, you had to both set up the filter and then you had to manually pick that flight. But now it will try to pick the first flight that satisfy our criteria. So it's much easier to look it up. Let's press Edit. And you can see here that Air Nostrum are set as the operator in this flight plan. So I think that feature will be a lot more easy for us updating flight plans or for us making user-airlines. Let's look up another airline. We have the CityJet. This time, instead of showing usage, I double-click it. And when I do that, you can go into this window and see the details for this flight. You cannot change anything because it's a factory airline, it's not a user airline. However, you can see all the information, and down here you also see the size category, and you see the number of flights for which it's operator and carrier. And you have this new button called Show Usage, and you can see like before, for this airline, it's utilized by a lot more flight plans. So if I were to change this airline or do something about it, I could see which flight plans I perhaps had to manually update. Let's look up another airline. And we have this one, Adria, and it's marked as a defunct because it ceased its operation in 2019, but we can see it's actually still in use. So if we right-click it and say Show Usage, we can see which flight plans are using this airline as an operator. For example, we have this Austrian. And the reason they are still using this airline, even though it became defunct in 2019, is because all of these 3 flight plans, you can see they are summer 19. They have not been updated by Alpha India Group since. And that is, as I explained in the beginning of the video, because of the COVID-19 situation. A lot of flight plans have not been updated. And once they become updated, I'm sure they will no longer utilize this airline. However, if you yourself see that as an issue that they are, you can copy this information to the clipboard and paste it into a notepad and have it running beside your program. And you can look them up and change them. Let's just for now look up Austrian Airlines. And let's scroll. We see it here. this single aircraft is said to be utilizing Adria as the operator. And if I want to change that, I can simply choose Austrian Airlines. And now it's no longer utilized by this flight plan. And if I were to hit save, I would save this information. I will, however, not do that. I'll rather wait for the updated flight plans when they will be ready. But if you yourself want to do this, you have the option to do so. In this version, a lot of airlines were updated, and also a lot of new airlines were added. When I first started making this program, the ICAO and IATA code had to be unique for that airline, but that changed many versions ago. So you can have multiple airlines with the same ICAO code. And that's because you might have some historic data. For example, let's return to Adria. Their ICAO code was ADR and their IATA code was JP. We still want to have this airline in the database. But since it have a C state, it's marked as a defunct airline. So if I unclick this box, I will no longer see it because it's defunct. And that's because we have flight plans utilizing this, but sometime in the future we might have a new airline utilizing the same IATA code and ICAO codes. And this feature we have also used to add, you can call them fictitious airlines. For example, companies flying business jets. They are not an official airline, and as such, they don't have an ICAO code or IATA code, but still we might have flight plans for these companies. And a system I devised together with Bruce was to use 3 dashes for the ICAO codes. It was Bruce's idea to use these 3 dashes for these fictitious airlines. And then I decided to use the IATA code to show which kind of traffic it is. All of these with Biz-jet are business jet flights or flights for different companies. And you can see a lot of them are actually in use because there's flight plans for these. And when we have the data, we will try to add a comment state, and if they become defunct, a C state. But again, that information is hard to come by. So you see a lot of business jet flights have been added in this version, all of these Biz-jet codes. But there are other codes also. Here we have FR for freight, Amazon Prime Air. They don't have their own ICAO code and IATA code. So they're added with these 3 dashes, and then FR as the IATA codes tell us it's a freight company. And we have flight plans utilizing these. So Amazon Prime Air is the carrier, and different freight companies are the operator of their flights. Here we have another freight. GV is short for government, so it's flight plans for airline. Different governments created as if they were airlines. ML is short for military, so here we have Chilean and Taiwan Air Force. PX is short for passenger. And then you see these with an asterisk. These are my user. So I have them in my personal user system. And I use 3D as short for this is a third-party company. I don't have, for example, any Aerosoft flight plans. But the way I use these is if we go to our user aircraft, and I were to pick, for example, this Let's take one of the Airbuses. This one. When I double click it, as I showed in a previous video, when you create these user-airlines, you can set up the repaints you have. And some repaints you'll have for the company also. For example, if I'm choosing one of the PMDGs, they will always have a house library. So in order to choose an airline that matches this house library, I've set up these as companies also. So that's how you use the User-airlines, and you use these fictitious airlines that's added in this version. One thing I forgot to mention, in here in the past, it would only show the carrier code of the carrier and the operator. And it's fine here that you could see it's AUA. You could quickly find out which airline that is. But if I choose, for example, one of the business jet flight plans, all of those I have prefixed with BZ. So when I choose edit, you see here they are all simply called 3 dashes and BC. So if I was not showing the name also, it would be difficult to see if it was actually the same, the correct airline that had been chosen. But you can do so now in this version. Some versions ago, I added a feature, so looking at the runways in the airport info form, you could see the crosswind and the headwind for that runway. For example, let's look up Copenhagen. When we go to the runway tab, you see all the runways here. And for each runway, you will see the headwind and the crosswind. In this case, we have a negative headwind, so it's a tailwind of 4 knots. And the crosswind in this case is 6.9 knots from the right or from the starboard side. And that is based on the wind direction and the wind speed chosen up here. And these information are automatic obtained from the meta information. Here you see the wind comes from direction 160 and the strength is 0.8 knots. So that is the information that's entered up here. If you expect the wind to be, for example, 200 degrees when you approach this airport, you can change it and it will recalculate that. If this is the case, for example, also the wind may be stronger. In that case, if we were to choose this one, we'll have a 11 knots tailwind, so perhaps we better choose this one. In this case, we have an 11.3 knots headwind, and we will have a 4.1 knots crosswind from the left side or the port side. While we're in here, I want to point out that in this new version, I have also included the traffic pattern direction for each runway. So here the traffic pattern is left, both for takes-off and landings. The issue with these data is it's obtained from make runways, and it takes the data from the scenery. And most default scenery will simply list the traffic pattern to be left no matter how it is. For example, this one is the freeware Paderborn scenery made by Aerosoft for MSFS. And since it's a third-party runway, we can actually see it have some useful traffic pattern data. But let's return to the crosswind and the headwind. These information, as I said, these information up here are automatic obtained from the meta file or the metadata, and you can change them up here. But if you were to calculate the headwind and the wind speed for something different than runways, you cannot see it in the previous version. In this version, however, you have this new menu item called Wind Calculator. And here you can add, for example, the heading of a runway or the direction we are flying. For example, if we are flying direction 145 and we have a wind coming from 90 and the strength of this wind is, for example, 15 knots, we can see here in that case we would have a headwind of 8.6 knots. And we will have a crosswind of 12.3 knots coming from the left of the port side. It means if you, even though our nose is pointing in this direction, this is not direction we are flying. So we will need to point our nose into the wind. In this case, we will need to point our nose more left-wise to keep flying this heading. If you wind knots, you don't have the value in knots, but you perhaps have it in meter per seconds. We can open this one and say, for example, our wind might be 8 meters per second, and we can see in that case it would be 15.5 knots. So I can simply copy that value here, and it will change the values here. So that's how you use this new wind calculator. Also in this version, I've added the Morse codes of the runways. So if we look up Copenhagen again, and we go to the runways, in this case, all of the runways have an ILS ID. They are all ILS equipped. It will not always be the case for all airports. Let's, for example, choose Boston. You see we have runways without ILS and we have runways with ILS. Whenever we have an ILS ID in this version, it will list the Morse that ID as a Morse code here in parentheses. This text can be a bit hard to read, so I write it up here also with a larger fixed font. Here, when nothing, they don't have an ILS ID, so it will be blank. But if they have an ILS ID, it will be listed here. For example, here we say it's iBoss. So I is 2 dots, a B is a dash and 3 dots, O is 3 dashes, and S is 3 dots. So we can read it here, and we can press this button to listen how it would sound as a Morse code. And this is mostly relevant for you, for those of you flying simple aircrafts or aircraft with simple avionics. If you have modern avionics, they will list the ID of the ILS when we dial in the correct frequency and we are in range. So we can simply read that Morse code. But if you're flying a more simple aircraft or aircraft with simple avionics, we cannot see that ID perhaps. Instead, we will have to dial in the navigation radio to the frequency and then turn up the volume and listen to the Morse code in order to be able to determine if this is the correct station or ILS we have dialed in. And for that, you can both see the Morse code and you can hear it. This is fine for ILS IDs. But what if it's a VOR radio you need to navigate to? And for that purpose, in this version, I also added this text to Morse code. For example, if we have a VOR radio we have dialed our radio into, and we know it have an ID, perhaps it's SID, and we can simply type it here, and we can see the Morse code, and as before, we can listen to it. And this can help us to determine if it is the correct navigation radio we are receiving signal from. There are no limitations up here. Here I just entered 3 letters, but as you can see here, you can type anything, and even numbers it have Morse codes for, and also here we have 3 special Danish letters. It have Morse code for those. You have Morse codes for comma, dot, and minus, and so on. But its main purpose is for you to enter the IDs of the navigation radios, so you can listen to what you're receiving. In this version, I also added a feature requested by a user called Bernd. The way he used the program is if he was sitting down a Saturday afternoon and he wanted to fly a flight out of, for example, Munich, he would like to be able to filter flights that were only leaving Munich on a Saturday. And in the previous version, you cannot do that. You could set a filter by airport, and you could set a filter by time. For example, it had to leave Munich between 12 o'clock and 2 o'clock in the afternoon local time. But you could not say only for Saturday, so he would have to put his filter up, and he would manually have to choose the flights. In this version, you can filter by weekdays. So pressing Ctrl L and reset the search criteria, I can, for example, choose I want it to be an outbound flight. It have to go out. I don't care about flights going into. I know the ICAO code of Munich, but otherwise I could look it up. And I could say local time, it have to departure between 12 o'clock noon or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And local time, but as a new feature in this version, you can choose weekdays. When you hover the mouse over this button, the tooltip will tell which day are selected. And you can simply read the last part of the top line. It's all days selected, so you don't have to read the bottom line with the X for the days selected. In this case, we only want to see flights leaving on a Saturday. So we click the days button, and you see by default all days are selected. So I press none, and I choose Saturday, and I press OK. So now when I hover over, I can see only an X next to Saturday. And I perform my search, and I say OK. And now we can see we are only seeing flights departing from Munich. And if I double click Munich and I go to the legs page, you can see this inbound box is empty, and that was because we chose to only see outbound flights. And you can see we choose the departure time between 12 o'clock in the at noon and 2 o'clock in the afternoon, both local times. So these are the flights, the only flights you're seeing. You're not seeing, you see they all start with SA for Saturday. So if you want to fly the flights real time as they're flown in the real world, you can now use this day feature to limit your searches. And pressing Ctrl L again, you can see that it goes both for departure and arrival time. But otherwise, the search function is working as it did in the past. Beside the items I've shown so far, there are also many small changes, and there are many bug fixes and other things that have changed in this version. For example, choosing a random flight here and looking at as the report we can generate here. We now have some more information. For example, now I have started to size categorize the airlines. It's shown up here. In this case, for this flight, S7 Airlines are both the carrier and the operator, so this is only shown as a single line. Had it been a different carrier and a different operator, that would be one line saying carrier and one saying operator, and for each of them you could see the ICAO code, the IATA code, the name, the call sign, the size classification and the load factor for that airline. Also in this version, for each airport, the departure airport and the destination airport, I now list the runways. And for each runway, I will list the name of the runway, the course, the surface, the length in feet, and here converted to meters also. If the runway is ILS equipped, you will see the ID of that ILS. You will see that ID as the Morse-code, and you will see the frequency and the course for that ILS, and you will see the glide slope. Also, I added this pattern information, if it's a left or right based. And again, TL is short for takeoff and landing. If it's the same, it will just say the direction, and then both T/L. Had it been different for landing and takes off, it would say left and a T, and then right and a L. But as I said, this information is obtained from the scenery, and most of the default scenery simply say left. So sadly, we cannot trust it to be correct for the real world. So these are the changes to this report. I'm sure I made some other minor changes I forgot all about, but some changes have been made to this report. If you want to see all of the changes and the fixes in this version, as always, simply go to the About box, and they are all listed here. The way I do it, I always first list the new things and the change things. Then I list what have been fixed in the program if I find some errors. Then I list what have happened to the data file. In this case, a lot of had changed to the airline database and so on. And lastly, I list what have changed to the flight plans. In this version, I chose to rebundle all of the business jet flight plans made by Eric Steinmetz. In previous version, it was bundled, and then I decided to remove it, and it was offered as a separate download. But here in version 19, I have decided to rebundle these flight plans with the Flighplan Visualizer. So it's still an optional install, and it's not chosen by default, but when you run the installer, you have the option to put a check mark to install these business jet flight plans if you want. In this version, they have all been updated. They have not been updated to new flight plans, but they have been updated to use these new fictitious airlines for companies that don't have official ICAO codes. And also in the past, you could not see the author of those flight plans. Normally, if you choose a flight plan, I choose one random here. When I hover the mouse, I can see who created it. If I press edit, I can also see who created it. And also here in the help menu in the flight plans per author, you could see per author which flight plan that author made. And in the past, you could not do that with the business jet flight plans. And that was because I made those business jet flight plan before I added this feature with the author. But in this version, as you can see here, all of the business jet flight plans have now been marked with Eric Steinmetz as the author. I plan to update these with new versions of business jet flight plans, or updated data for business jet flight plans sometime in the future. But right now, except for the things I mentioned here, these are basically the same flight plans for that I have been offered as a separate download before. But no longer you don't have to manually download and install those. You can do it with the standard installer. Thank you.